Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'll be doing my usual rundown of Prime Minister's questions, which returned after the Christmas recess, as Leader of the Opposition Keir Starmer hauled Sunak over the coals with regards to the NHS strikes, but also, importantly, it turned the focus onto the damage that's been done to the NHS before COVID to prevent the government's main smokescreen. Needless to say, Sunak was forced to drag up the same sorry retaliations because he is completely unable to defend his party's 13 years in office. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the NHS, and more specifically the Tory stewardship of the NHS, very much on the agenda for Labour today. It is usual for the first question to go to a backbencher before the Leader of the Opposition, and today it was Labour MP Cat Smith who asked how long Sunak had to wait for his last NHS dentist appointment. And just as it's traditional for a backbencher to ask the first question, it seems to be traditional these days for the Prime Minister not to answer it. He did not answer this question. You know, recently he has been very evasive about his use of private healthcare. Everyone knows he uses private healthcare. Why not just say so? Well, today he sort of did. He replied that he was registered with an NHS GP, which hasn't really got a lot to do with dentistry, but never mind. He said he was registered with an NHS GP, but has used independent healthcare in the past. Well, all healthcare is used as in the past because he's stood up in the House of Commons. We know he's not using it right now. But, you know, every time he needs something, you can get it done privately. That's what he's saying. Every time he needs something you can get done privately, he will get it done privately. The mention of being registered with an NHS GP, utterly irrelevant, so is everyone. There are some services you have access to only with the NHS that you can't get privately. So of course he's registered with an NHS GP. The point the MP was making, that he has an easy way of circumventing long waiting lists for appointments that he and his party inflict on ordinary people. And he uses them whenever he feels the need. He couldn't deny that. No waiting for weeks for a GP appointment for Richie Rich, is there? Sorry, Rishi Sunak. Oh, Rishi Sunak, where is my head? You know, then on to Starmer's questions. And he said the health workers would not be on strike if the government negotiated. He asked why Sunak was prolonging the strikes. And then Sunak hid behind one of his, I think he's got about 3 arguments floating around at the moment on the industrial action. You know, he said, I accepted the pay review recommendations. That's all that's happening here. It's not my fault. It's the pay review board. But this cuts no ice with anyone who knows how a pay review board works. They are independent. That is true. They are independent. And they take evidence from a range of sources, including unions. But their guidelines are written by the government. They don't just get to decide what people should be paid themselves. They don't get to set their own criteria. The government write it for them. There is a reason why healthcare and other public sector workers get above inflation pay rises under Labour governments and below inflation real terms pay cuts under Conservative governments. Right. The same pay review boards who give real terms pay rises under Labour don't randomly do the opposite when the Conservatives come to power, do they? Sunak also tried a dodge that Boris Johnson used from time to time, attacking Labour for opposing some legislation they say is designed to solve a problem. In reality, of course, it doesn't do anything of the sort. You know, Johnson would do the same, and Sunak was doing the same with, he asked Starmer why he wasn't backing his minimum safety legislation. It could be that there's no such legislation in the works. What Sunak may mean was his minimum service strike-breaking legislation. But this is when Starmer decided to turn the focus onto the state of the NHS before the pandemic. He said that waiting lists had doubled under the Tories by 2019. He said before anyone had heard of COVID, you'd already doubled the waiting list. You cannot legislate your way out of 13 years of failure, he said. Now, I thought that wasn't entirely fair of Starmer. Sunak could actually legislate. He could introduce a bill to Parliament for a snap election. I mean, that would help at least stop the 13 years of failure turning into 15 years. But the general thrust is good. The problem with a focus on the NHS as it is now is that the Tories keep blaming COVID. Also people can see how the system's knackered now. Labour, yeah, every now and then mention it, but they don't really need to have a particular focus on how badly broken healthcare is right now, because people can see it. But by focusing on the state of the NHS in 2019, first of all, you remove COVID from the equation. But also you're reminding people what it was like, because it's a few years ago. People may not remember. And Sunak then just, what did he do? Brought up his legislation again. It's a truly awful response. Not just because, so the legislation is a smokescreen. It's a feeble attempt at distraction, because the legislation doesn't even pretend to do anything other than stop people striking. But he was asked about the state of things in 2019 and had no answer. He didn't say what he was going to do to fix the healthcare problems. What's he trying to suggest? That the only reason there's healthcare problems now is because nurses are on strike? They've only just gone on strike, mate. These were problems years ago. How would anti-strike legislation help the NHS when it was knackered, when no strikes were taking place? Starmer then used the, I think what is now routine Labour line, that Sunak's gone from clapping nurses to sacking them. He asked something which I raised in my video about Sunak's New Year promises, because one of them was to cut waiting lists. And I said at the time, what does that mean then? How much are you going to cut them by then? Be specific here. Starmer was that person asking, because someone needed to ask it. He asked Sunak if the promise meant to cut it to the 4.6 million waiting list that was there pre-COVID. Or did he mean the one that existed under the last Labour government, which was half of that? And again, it might be an opportune moment here, actually, to show the recent graph in the Financial Times, I hope I remember, which compares and contrasts Labour and Conservatives in government. One of them showed NHS waiting lists based on how they were measured from 2009, because the way they were measured sort of changed a few times. But the way they were measured in 2009 is the way they're still measured now. And that makes it all fair then. So this graph is particularly instructive because it shows two different Conservative governments straddling the Labour government. And you can just see it really, look, blue line up, red line down, blue line up. And what did Sunak have to say to this? Drum roll, please. But COVID, you absolute Burke, you were being given figures from pre-COVID. You cannot defend the doubling of waiting lists pre-COVID by blaming COVID. You just watch me, Sunak seemed to say. I've got nothing else to fall back on. And that's it, isn't it? He hides behind independent bodies who nonetheless act according to his instructions. When that doesn't work, he blames the virus or sometimes a foreign power that his party's accepted millions in donations from. And when all that doesn't work, he moans about the unions. Oh, Labour's only saying this because they're in hock to the unions, even though the unions in question are not actually affiliated to Labour. Vast majority of the time when Sunak's moaning about a union, including today, it's not a union that is actually affiliated to Labour. The one slight exception may be Unite in this particular case, because Unite do represent some nurses. But it wasn't just me who thought Sunak's response was emptier than the big book of Tory good deeds either. Starmer said, look, when you scratch the surface with Sunak, there is nothing there. And he then looked back at the past again. And I like this as well because it does two things. First of all, like I've already said, it's removing COVID from the equation. It's saying, look, in 2019, we didn't have COVID, but we still had a knackered NHS. But also what he's doing is reminding people how much better things were under Labour, because he wants people to look back to the last Labour government as a way of looking forward to the next Labour government. So he asked when people would be able to get a GP appointment in 2 days, like you could under Labour. Sunak's response was basically, we're doing it now, we're getting it sorted, shut up. Nothing about why the wait time ever went from 2 days to multiple weeks, other than but COVID, even though this sorry state of affairs existed before the pandemic. And Starmer wasn't finished by comparing access to healthcare now with how it was under Labour. He also brought cancer care in as well, said that people can't get an ambulance on non-strike days. Don't blame the strikes. You can't even get an ambulance when there isn't a strike. Said that Sunak's promises for the NHS essentially just come down to, at some point, we might stop making things worse. And all Sunak could do was blame the unions, complain that Labour were on their side, and use the third of his bag of tricks. I mean, in all seriousness, seriously here, Tory MPs, they can't get rid of Sunak. Of course they can't get rid of Sunak. It's a sad state of affairs for them. They're just not in a place where they've got anyone credible to do the job. That's sad, but there you go. They can't let Johnson back in. That's a non-starter. Never mind the far right trying to claim in the Tory press that Labour are afraid of Johnson returning. That's just to try and get Tory MPs to back Johnson again. The reality is Starmer would piss himself laughing all the way to the next election. But they do need to tap Sunak on the shoulder and tell him, look, mate, you need to get some lessons in how to handle yourself. Because piss poor performances like this in PMQs are one thing. They're damaging enough, but the damage is relatively limited. At some point, there's going to be an election. Now, with rebels lurking in the shadows, Sunak cannot even guarantee it won't be this year, although that is unlikely. But there will be an election at some point. And then Sunak is going to be cross-examined in a much more public forum. TV debates for a start. He needs to get much better at this. Yes, after 13 years of Tory rule, he doesn't have a great deal to work with. But I mean, never mind making a silk purse out of a pig's ear. He's not even making a pig's ear purse out of his pig's ear. Then Stephen Flynn of the SNP, attacking the Tories' economic record. Said bringing long recession, Brexit, inflation, high interest rates and so on. And when Sunak tried to counter on the subject of the SNP's lack of support for the energy industry, Flynn replied with what is clearly going to be his line, he's used it before, that Scotland is energy rich but fuel poor. And then what did Sunak do? Oh, no, sorry, Flynn. He said, he pointed out that while Boris Johnson was getting paid, £1 million for speeches, the Tories are stopping ordinary people from striking for fair pay. And Sunak then came back with, I don't even know what he was thinking. He said, oh, you're talking about predecessors. What are your predecessors for Russia Today? And I thought, really? That's what you've got? I mean, ignore the puerile nature of the reply, because politics is actually more like a school playground slanging match than a reasoned debate most of the time anyway. But this is like his break the emergency glass on the Corbyn attack line for Labour, isn't it? Former leader. The former leader he's referring to is not only a very former leader, like going back years, but it's no longer even in their party. In fact, so much is Alex Salmond no longer in their party. He's in a different party altogether. Also, I'm not sure any Tory leader is all that wise attacking politicians for going on Russia Today, when his own party has accepted millions in donations from oligarchs close to Putin. In fact, had Flynn been permitted another question, he wasn't, of course, and Sunak would have known he wasn't, but, for future reference, Flynn may have explained that actually it was the current SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, that forced Salmond to resign from his RT show years ago. Whereas Rishi Sunak has appointed at least one member of his cabinet who used to appear on it. So either it was wrong to appear on it, or it wasn't wrong to appear on it years ago. I mean, you wouldn't do it now, but, in terms of, you can't have it both ways. I'm not sure this is an argument Sunak really wants to get into. But it seems that Sunak is no better than Johnson, really. He responds with things that sound good at the time, but would be a hindrance in the long term. You wouldn't want to get into an extended exchange on some of these points. It's almost like there's a link between people who go to particularly exclusive private schools and never grow out of childish taunts well into adulthood. But the problem with childish taunts, they may get your backbenchers baying. They're not going to work in a debate that the public are watching. And Johnson had charisma on his side. See, he had the old ladies who wanted to ruffle his hair and tell people, leave him alone, because they reminded him of the roguish grandson they had. They wanted to just love and mother. Didn't matter as much that Johnson was bad at debates, at least until he blotted his copybook with Downing Street parties and all the lies, of course. But I've seen no evidence that elderly voters want to mother Sunak. He's not going to get the same treatment as Johnson. He is going to have to rely rather more heavily on his debating skills come the election, which means he's going to have to acquire some. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.